The long-awaited Renters' Rights Bill became law on Monday. It's been described as the biggest shake-up to renting in England in more than 30 years, scrapping no-fault evictions, as well as giving tenants greater rights to challenge rent increases. Well, here to tell us if it's as good as it sounds is housing and society correspondent for the iPaper, Vicky Spratt. Vicky, welcome to Pod Save the UK.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Good to see you. Are we popping champagne corks?
Not yet, Nish, not yet. And I'll tell you why. So the bill has received royal assent. The Renters' Rights Bill has become the Renters' Rights Act. This has been years in the making. The Tories first promised renters reform back in 2017. I mean, I feel like I've lived 100 lives since then, and thousands of people have been evicted from their homes since then, more to the point. But just because we've got royal assent doesn't mean we actually know when any of this is going to become something that actually impacts people's lives. We're waiting to hear from the government about a timeline for implementation. At the moment, I don't really know when that is, and nobody's saying. So hold the champagne. Hopefully it's soon, but maybe it's not. I mean, what's going on? I'd love to know.
First of all, if you don't know, I definitely don't know. Just clarify for me before we actually talk about the specifics of this. Why is this taking so fucking long? Because we actually talked about this on one of the very first episodes of this podcast back in May 2023.
Yeah, imagine how I feel as a housing correspondent. I mean, this has been like almost a decade of my life. Great question. Okay, let's go back to the Tories. They just couldn't get it past their own backbenchers, ultimately. And also they kept ousting their leaders and bringing new ones in,
Sure.
which was very destabilizing for the country and for legislation. And actually, in some ways, I think the Renters' Rights Act is a really good example of why political instability is the enemy of decent policy, because this is something that's going to stop people becoming homeless, right? And it's taken that long for politicians to get their act together, and it took a new government to actually get it over the line. They've gone further than the Conservative version was going to go. We can get into what's actually in it, but I think it's more robust. And from them winning the election to now, just over a year, for a piece of legislation, I'd say this is quite rapid.
So one thing this bill does, which you mentioned, is end Section 21, which is the no-fault eviction clause. Landlords will now need a legal reason to evict you, like rent arrears or antisocial behaviour. That's a big deal, right?
It is a huge deal, Zoe, and at least we hope that's how it's going to work. And I think we need to see how it's going to be enforced. But yeah, in theory, now Section 21 will be gone. Section 21 meant a landlord could ask you to leave just 2 months' notice and they didn't have to give you a reason. So it was often, even though it wasn't supposed to be used this way, a sort of retaliatory thing. If you asked for repairs or you made a complaint, just easier to get you out. Now they'll have to use something called Section 8, so they can evict you if you're behind on your rent. Rent arrears is a legitimate reason for eviction. If you're found to be guilty of antisocial behaviour, having lots of loud parties or worse, you will be at risk of eviction. And there is another avenue. So if a landlord wants to get the home back so they can live in it themselves or they can sell it, then they can evict their tenants. But they have to wait 6 months if they want to relist it for rent after they've done that. So some of your listeners may have come across a story that I put out in August about the former homelessness minister, Rushanara Ali, no longer the homelessness minister, because she had made some of her tenants homeless. By asking them to leave and saying she was going to sell and then relisting the property at a higher rent. She said she was trying to sell the property. That wasn't what she was doing, but the tenants disagreed. They said that their home was taken away from them and they had to find other places to live, and one of them ended up sofa surfing for a bit. But that is now not allowed. If you say you're going to sell the property as a landlord, you have to sell it, and you can't relist it at a higher rent within 6 months.
MOJ data shows that there's been more than 11,000 no-fault bailiff evictions just in the last year. But it's really important that you've stressed that there are circumstances like antisocial behaviour that allows, and rent arrears that allows landlords to evict tenants. Because I have read a few slightly hysterical opinion pieces saying that this now basically means that their tenants are allowed to just smash their genitals and their faces every morning, and no one should ever be a landlord, and Britain's basically communist China. Like that, I've read a few sort of opinion pieces of that flavour this week, Vicky. Can you reassure the beleaguered landlord community that have suffered so harshly at the hands of Mao Se Starmer In fact, this doesn't mean that tenants can take a big dump on the floor and smear it into the curtains and not be removed from their houses.
I really hope somebody has checked on those landlords this morning. That sounds terrible and certainly illegal. In the rage bait, clickbait era of online content, you will be unsurprised to know there are some people saying this is a terrible idea and it's going to crash the housing market. I don't think that's true. And I would point you to the fact that Granger, one of our country's biggest commercial landlords, they do a lot of build to rent properties, issued a statement saying how great they thought this legislation was and how much they welcomed it. So things can't be that bad, can they? Landlords can absolutely still evict their tenants and they can get properties back. They can't just chuck them out at short notice for no reason.
The Act also legislates something that you should never have needed a law on in the first place, which is the right to be safe in your own home. This is Awab's Law, named after the case of Awab Ishaq, a 2-year-old boy who died in 2020 after prolonged exposure to mold in his housing association flat in Rochdale. His father had raised the issue multiple times. And of course, his death, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. I mean, I couldn't believe the other night I was listening to a radio phone in which had multiple landlords ringing up to say that mold is only ever the tenant's fault, which I thought was extraordinary. But now, finally, social landlords, or generally the council or a housing association, will be legally required to investigate and fix hazards within a strict time frame. But let's be clear, this law exists because the system failed so catastrophically that a toddler died.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself, Zoe. Honestly, I find our story quite hard to talk about sometimes because sometimes as a journalist you have these moments where you think, I'm not writing what I'm writing, am I?
Yeah.
Surely that didn't happen. And in the detail of what was said to his family, they were blamed for the way they were bathing, the way they were cooking, for the mold and damp in their house by the housing association. And their kid died from a respiratory problem that he developed because of that mold. Mold and damp, so dangerous. And landlords become very defensive about it. And I remember when I was a private renter, I'm not anymore. Once I was told that it was because I was drying my washing. I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? Because there's no tumble dryer.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've got to wash clothes. Like, what do you do? And I, when I was reading everything that was said to Awab's family, that was reminding me of that. And I think there's so much victim blaming that goes on with tenants. The Awab's law is a really, really important piece of legislation. And I think it really sets a standard for social landlords. And I really hope that the Renters' Rights Act makes it clear that actually landlords are housing providers, right? That's what they are. We should call them housing providers.
Yeah.
And I think when you put it that way, these standards all make a lot more sense. You're providing housing. That's the same as providing food,
Yeah.
right? There are food standards. If you go to a restaurant, you'll see the certificates. There are inspections. Why have we accepted that not existing in housing for so long?
That's such a brilliant way of putting it because, I mean, if you're a food provider, as a restaurant is, and you keep giving people diarrhea, that is probably going to impact your business model in the long term. But as things stand, this law, Arb's law, only applies to social rented housing. So do you think that this has provided a kind of framework and a pathway to which we can get these kind of things in place for the private sector as well?
Yeah, absolutely. My understanding is that the intention is that our law will also apply to the private rented sector at some point. Again, we're waiting on the timeline for implementation. Perhaps that will change, but that is my understanding of what's coming down the track. And the decent home standard, which by the way already existed in social housing, and meant that landlords weren't supposed to like rent out homes with category 1 hazards like mold and damp, applies to both sectors now. So, well, as soon as this all comes into force. So there are now minimum standards, but I'm not completely confident that the Renters' Rights Act is going to mean that suddenly we have a functioning system, because I think councils are really overstretched. I keep writing about how services are crumbling, not just in housing, but in every other aspect of public life. And I do worry that this might be quite difficult to enforce. But the fact that we're talking about it so much is a good thing.
Let's now just talk about affordability. I mean, that's sort of kind of the core of the crisis here. From what I understand, Vicky, landlords can increase rent to market rate. But what is market rate? I'm not ordering fish in a restaurant. Like I'm sort of slightly confused as to what that phrase means in this context. For listeners, Vicky looks very, very depressed.
I find it so increasingly really difficult to talk about this because I get so much crap on Twitter every time I dare to talk about affordability, whether it's in, buying a home or renting a home. I actually think your analogy of market fish is quite a good one, Nish.
I always
So
accidentally stumble on useful points.
you've done it again. It's not the first time I've heard you do it, and I just want to congratulate you on how good you are.
A stop clock.
So basically, like when you go into a restaurant and they say, "Oh, this is the market price from today," you don't really have a way of checking that,
No.
right? The rental market is, it's a bit more accountable than that because you can see what homes are listed. But actually, the market rent is dictated by what people will pay. And yesterday, the day before I spoke to you guys, I gave evidence to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee about some of this stuff based on what I've been seeing across the country. And I was sat alongside an economist from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And he said, well, market rent is quite a good measure of affordability because it's what people will pay. And I said, yeah, but I know people who don't eat, don't go on holiday, feed their kids, not themselves, to be able to afford higher rent on a slightly nicer home. So is it a measure of affordability if they're sacrificing so many other things, that they could use their income to pay for? Because at the end of the day, you can't not have a house, right? So market rents are generally linked to people's incomes. When incomes go up, rents go up because people will pay a bit more, but also because landlords then start charging a bit more. So I think it's a really, really interesting area because the fact that fewer people have been able to afford to buy a home for really complicated reasons, including regulations that came in after 2008 and epic house price inflation, has meant more people need to rent privately. The fact that we don't have as much social housing as we used to have means you've got more lower income tenants renting privately. All of this has created more of what economists call demand, which has driven up rents, right? But I think you have to think about the difference between need and demand, because everybody needs a house. So of course they're going to pay whatever they can, or even what they can't, right? Like I remember once actually taking out a bank loan to pay rent on a flat that all my friends wanted to rent that I couldn't afford, but I wanted to live with them, not strangers. So I took out a bank loan to cover my rent for 5 months. So, I'm sure there are other people out there doing that. But to go back to the Renters' Rights Act, I think what's really, really good about it, but again, controversial, is there's going to be a tribunal where if you are hit with an unfair rent hike that's above the prices in your area, you can challenge it. Again, we're waiting for the detail on how that's going to work. My understanding is that's going to become clear in the coming weeks, but it is a good thing. And they've just introduced rent control in Scotland. Rent control, again, very controversial. The evidence is mixed. Does it work? Doesn't it work? I guess we'll see in Scotland. It can be a bit of a test case. But what we have got in England is now there's some new statistics out this week showing that people are spending, more than half of their take-home pay on their rent.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if your housing costs exceed a third of your take-home pay, it's unaffordable. So that's where we are.